Special thank you to Avi and Dov and all those who are involved with preparing tonight's Malav Malka and Shir. I figured what I would do with you tonight, B'siyata D'Shmaya, the Chevra asked me to talk about some ideas preparing for the Seder. So I'd like to share with you, I have a list of quite a few themes that's connected to Leila Pesach, which relate to different parts of the first half of the Haggadah. And so what I'll try to do with you is go through some basic themes in the Haggadah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, and maybe some of them will be helpful for you in preparing for the Seder. I'm not in a rush tonight, so for those of you who want after the Shir to discuss about how to take these themes and making them practical and so on, a few years ago, my wife Shetichya and I sat with the women, and we spoke about making the Seder practical, and I think my wife's insights were even better than mine, and that's also already on Torah Anytime. So my brother-in-law was very excited that he got to put his sister on Torah Anytime. That was very, very meaningful for him. But I guess as men together, we could discuss after the Shir. So let's begin. The way to begin might be the way in our Masorah, the way they began. I heard from Rav Branspiegel, who heard from Rav Soloveitchik, who either heard from his father or might have been at Reb Chaim of Brisk's Seder, and it's been written down, I think it's been transcribed already, that Reb Chaim used to begin his Seder with the kasha of the Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas Chinuch asks the following question. He says that when it comes to the mitzvah Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim on the night of Pesach, so that mitzvah really is hard to understand how it could be the 21st mitzvah in the Sefer HaChinuch. Because at the end of the day, it's true, V'chol hamaper l'saper l'siyas Mitzrayim ha'reizim meshubach, etc., but really we have a mitzvah on every night of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. And so if you want to say that there's some type of mahadrin on Leil Pesach to be marbe l'saper Yetzias Mitzrayim, fine. But that's not how the Chinuch codifies it. It's not how the Rambam codifies it. I have the Rambam in front of me in Perek Zayin Halach Aleph. Mitzvah sasei shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'niflois shenas l'avosem Mitzrayim b'leil chamisha aser b'nisan. Presumably, there's also a mitzvah that we're mekayim at Kriya Shema, but the Rambam and the Chinuch both don't discuss how this is a super Zechias Mitzrayim. It sounds like it's an entirely different mitzvah. And Reb Chaim Zechusei Yogan Aleinu answered that if you look in the Rambam in Perek Zayin, you'll see that the Rambam delineates. I encourage you to take a look at Perek Zayin in Hilchos Chametz Matzah, that the Rambam describes features of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim that make it entirely different than the mitzvah of Zechira. It's an entirely different mitzvah. It's not the pshat that it's a super Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, that on the night of Pesach that you're supposed to do Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with a riboy, but rather it's an entirely different mitzvah. What is that entirely different mitzvah? So if one reads the Rambam delineates three differences. Number one, the Rambam says that it's done b'derech shelo tshuva. It's done with question and answers. Number two, the Rambam describes that it's, and the Rambam there emphasizes, just before I get to number two, the Rambam says, v'tzarech lasos shinu b'layla azeh kadei shiru habanim v'yishalu. So in other words, all the shinuyim of the Leil HaSeder are there to initiate a give and take between father and son. Number two, the Rambam in Halacha Dalet says, v'tzarech lahaschil b'gnus l'sayim b'shevach, that one needs to start b'gnus and sayim l'shevach. Contrasted to the mitzvah Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's a statement. There's no dialectic in Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's Ani Hashem Elokechem. It's a statement. Number two is the Rambam says there is a story that starts b'gnus l'sayim b'shevach. Of course, that's a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Where does that start? Where does the gnus start? Does it go all the way back to Arami Oved Avi? or does it start already in Mitzrayim? But at the end of the day, there you have that second difference. And the third difference is that the Rambam describes in Halacha Hey, Kol Mishlo Amar Shlosha Dvarim Elu Belel Chamisha Asal Yatzu De Chavasa, that you need to say the words Pesach, Matzah, Umarar, and the Rambam emphasizes that the Matzah and Marar are supposed to be in front of us. So that was Reb Chaim's brisker answer to the question, that it's not the pshat that Zechiras Mitzvahs has a extra component Alel Pesach, but rather there are two entirely different mitzvahs. One is the statement, which is almost antithetical to dialectic. It's a statement of Emunah, of Ani Hashem Elokeichem, versus the night of Yitzias Mitzrayim is a full dialectic, and it has these three components of Shelo Utshuva, Maschel B'Gnus V'Sayim B'Shevach, and B'Shosh Sheish Matzah Mar Menachem Lefanecha. Rabbi Branchpiegel Zatzal added two things to what Reb Chaim said. I also heard this from Rav Shechter, from Rav Soloveitchik, named Reb Chaim. But Reb Branchpiegel added two very important parts. And he said that he thinks that Reb Chaim only described the halachic difference, but he didn't describe, if you will, maybe we could use the word the existential difference, or the result, the totzah in emotion that's supposed to take place in the individual. Because the Rambam in Halacha Vav, after he recounts these three differences, the Rambam writes, B'chol dor v'dor chayev adam laharos es atzmo ki'il hu yatsa miMitzrayim. So Rabbi Branchpiegel said that every once in a while you could get stuck with the halachic requirements, but miss the goal. And the goal is to create an experience of liros es atzmo ki'ilu, or lahar, the Rambam's lashon of course is laharos, es atzmo ki'ilu yatsa miMitzrayim. So don't be stuck on the fact that there are three halachic differences, but more than that, there is a goal that's supposed to take place. And the goal is where a person reads these three differences are supposed to bring a person to a place to visualize himself as if he's gone out of Mitzrayim. That's the entire goal. And that's what the Rambam says in the next halacha. Reb Chaim didn't emphasize that, but that is our goal. My brother Shlita, who's a very special Talmud Chacham, he was a Talmud Muvak, Rav Moshe Twersky, Zeichet Tzaddik Kadosh Livracha. So when he came back from Eretz Yisrael, he asked my father, Zechrona Livracha, that by the Seder, that we should stop by the Hallel Haggadah, the Hallel that we say at the end of Magid. We say these words: B'chol dar v'dar chayev adam liros es atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. So my brother asked my father that he should stop, and that we have in our family now, since my brother suggested that, we have a moment of silence right before Lefichach Anachnu Chayavim, or B'chol Dar V'Dar, right after Mar Zeh She'anu Ochlim, to mamish for us to reflect and to visualize ourselves as if we've gone out of Mitzrayim, because that really is the whole goal. As Reb Branchpiegel pointed out, the whole goal is to reach that place. It's not just that these are halachic differences, but there is a chalois, that's the next part of the Rambam, the fourth thing that the Rambam adds that would be different than Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. There's no requirement of liros es atzmo when it comes to Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. Reb Branchpiegel also added, and he told us this was his master thesis, this is what he wrote as his master thesis, he said that the sum total of all of this is that all of these things, the three differences that Reb Chaim taught us, is with the goal that we, as the cliche goes, we pass over, that the Masorah is passed over from father to son. Again, a stark difference between Ani Hashem Elokeichem Asher Hotzeisi Eschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim. There, that's a silent statement of Emunah that we say to ourselves in Kriya Shema. But the whole goal of Leil HaSeder is something that's entirely different. And that, of course, is the V'Higata Levincha. So all of these things are there to create, pedagogically, to create that sense of Mesiras HaTorah. And Reb Branchpiegel pointed out, he said those three things are integral to Jewish education. And that is the idea of Shelo Utshuva. It's an educational setting where children aren't encouraged to ask, and teenagers aren't encouraged to ask, and they aren't encouraged to explore with their parents or with their teachers, is a very, very faulty educational setting. That's number one. There has to be b'derech shelo u'tshuva. The second thing is that's extremely important. Rav Branspiegel was a master at this. And by the way, Rav Shechter also, some fellows here who zocha to hear Shinum from Rav Shechter, Rav Branspiegel pointed out that Maschel Begnus V'Sayim B'Shevach is really telling the story of the Jewish people and putting our children into that story, we becoming part of that story. And therefore, your personal family story becomes a very, very important part of that as well. Maschel Begnus V'Sayim B'Shevach is not just, again, a halachic requirement, but Maschel Begnus V'Sayim B'Shevach is the narrative of the Jewish people. So my Rebbe pointed out that number one, critical, in contrast to Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is this Derech Shelu Tshuva, number one. Number two is that it's done in a way that is a narrative. I said Rav Shechter's shiurim, if you'll notice, the way Rav Shechter teaches many sugyas, he teaches them as a story. Lamdus, I know there are some pure briskers out there that might get upset at me, but I feel passionately about this, and Rav Branspiegel also did this in many, many ways. Lamdus doesn't have to be just a conceptual analysis. When we sit down and when we learn a sugya, what we're doing is we're telling the story of the Jewish people. Rabbi Yehuda said Azoi, the Chacham said Azoi, and Ravina Rav Ashi said like this. And then what happened was the Rambam gave this psak, and the Ravid said this Azhaga. Now, that itself is a story. It's the story of the Jewish people. And then, for every single one of us should be connected to a Masorah. And then there's our Masorah of our Rabbeim. That's a story. And that's a story that goes thousands and thousands of years. As well as that usually halachic debates have fascinating stories that go along with it as well. And so sometimes Rav Branspiegel would stop and he would talk about the Achron that he was quoting. That becomes part of the Achron himself comes into the room, either in the historical sense, or in sometimes Rav Shechter is the master of this, is telling the story of the halacha, of how they dealt with that halacha in the time of the Amoraim, and how was the debate between Reb Chaim Oizer and the Brisker Rav. All of that becomes part of the story of the Jewish people. Maschel Begnus V'Sayim B'Shevach, and Torah should be taught that way. Torah should be taught as a story, and if there are Gedolei Torah who have that unique talent. But in terms of us, practically, when we teach our children, both B'Leil Seder, but even the entire year, is that you are part of the story of the Jewish people, you are part of the story of the Masorah, and passing that to your children and sharing that with your children, all of that is part of Maschel Begnus V'Sayim B'Shevach. And finally, Rav Branspiegel pointed out, his props are very, very important. Again, after a shir we could discuss, but even bring the Matzah Umara, Mirz Hashem, B'Meher V'Yameinu, the Pesach, V'Ezras Hashem, all of them become props. And so his point was that Jewish elementary education is really expressed in these three chilukim of the Leil HaSeder. So what's theme number one? Lesson number one, is this idea that Leil HaSeder and Jewish education in general is really, really expressed by these three distinctions between Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim and Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, and that becomes our avoda in terms of giving it over to the next generation. And as Pesach comes close, is a time for us to ask ourselves if we're doing that with our children properly, if there's a way that we could enhance. We could always do things better. If there's a way that we can enhance it, and practically is to reach the children B'Asher Husham. My Seder looks very, very different now than it did 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it was on the carpet. It was with the kids down. And so I guess eventually, Mirz Hashem, with the grandchildren, hopefully they'll make us young again, Be'ezras Hashem. But there are different stages, and at each stage we try with these three yisodos from Reb Chaim to reach the children. Number two, there's a fascinating, moving on to Kaddish, there's a fascinating shita of the Magen Avram. And that is that Kiddush on Leil Pesach has to be done after Tzeis HaKochavim. And the problem with that, my son just mentioned to me that in a totally different context that there's a Rishalmi that's mashra not this way, but according to the Bavli, definitely we know that we can make Kiddush early on Shabbos, what we call making an early Shabbos. So according to Bavli, at least, it's clear that that you can make Kiddush before Tzeis HaKochavim. Yet, when it comes to Leil Pesach, the halacha is that we make Kiddush specifically after Tzeis HaKochavim, which leaves us with a balance, because on the one hand, especially Baruch Hashem, there are many young children in the shul, so you want to start the Seder as early as possible. On the other hand, there's this constraint that says that you have to wait till Tzeis HaKochavim. So what is the pshat? So Rav Soloveitchik said what's obvious, and that is that you need to say that from here we see that the Kiddush on Leil Pesach is entirely different than the Kiddush on Shabbos, that it's not just being Mekadesh Hayom, but rather the Kiddush is a chelek of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim itself, and Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim only begins after Tzeis HaKochavim. And of course it's mechuvan to the 4 Lishonos of Geula. But maybe there is something else that one could add to this phenomenon. In the tradition of Slonim, in the Schus Avos, that's the Haggadah, the Slonim or Haggadah, he says that the Chiyuv of Kiddush, why is Kadesh a chelek of the Seder? He says because everything has to start with the Hachana de Kedusha. In other words, Kadesh is not just, as we said in Lomdus, the Kiddush of Yom Tov, but rather Kadesh is the first of the Lashonos of Geula. That Lashon of Geula, Kadesh, is Lahachines Atzmecha La'avodas HaKodesh. And that means 2 things. Number 1, we know the word Kedusha is to set aside. That's the biblical meaning, Pentugdash HaMaleya. The Lashon of Kedusha is to be separated. And anything that we're going to accomplish in Kedusha is if we separate ourselves and we prepare ourselves. Pashut la'achin et atzmecha. And that's why it's special what you're doing tonight, by us sitting down and learning with each other. But it also means that everything in Avodas Hashem that we accomplish needs to be done with the appropriate hachana. V'yoser mizeh, in the Slonim, what they're also teaching and what they're also emphasizing is that this avoda has the potential to create a tremendous amount of kedusha, and the Leil HaPesach is a hachana for a tremendous amount of kedusha. We'll see if we'll get to this, but I wanted to share all the way at the end, towards the end of Magid, I wanted to share with you a beautiful ha'ara that Rabbi Yitzchak Lavarka made. He pointed out that the pasuk in Micha says, Ki meit seischa me'eretz Mitzrayim, er'enu niflaos. That's the pasuk in Micha Perek Zayin. So here, this is a Mesorah that we have from Amshinav. I guess I'm a little strange. I have Mesorahs from very different types of beautiful traditions. I hope it helps my avodas Hashem. So Rabbi Yitzchak Lavarka said, "Delo nemar esen niflos, ela er'enu niflos. Shekol haniflos v'hageulos she'iyah ad bias goel ubechlolam hageula asida hakol nase kvar b'yitzias Mitzrayim shorish hageulas." So Leil Yitzias Mitzrayim is the night that is the shorish of all geulas. There's a special Eved Hashem here in the neighborhood. One of your friends, he said with me such sincerity Friday morning. He said to me, I was so excited that maybe this Rosh Chodesh Nisan Mashiach was going to come. That Thursday he was mamish, someone here in the neighborhood. Mamish was, and look, there's so many steps that we're taking closer. B'siyata d'shmaya gula it could come at any moment, and it could be this b'siyata d'shmaya. He was hoping that already he'd be able to do the Karban Pesach already. So he wanted already to have time to prepare. That should be by Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So, but the Leil HaGeula, what Rabbi Yitzchak Lavarka points out, is that the Pasuk Pshat in the Pasuk in Micha, Ki meit seischem eretz Mitzrayim er'enu niflos, I will show you niflos. In other words, all of the future niflos of Klal Yisrael are put into play on the first Yitzias Mitzrayim, and that will continue we will continue to be zocha to see it. Already the Geula Asida was already put into play below Yitzias Mitzrayim. It just has to be revealed. That we should prepare ourselves. Maybe we'll get to that later on. That's part of the end of the Haggadah. So this time of Leil HaSeder, that's why we start with Kaddish. The Kaddish doesn't just mean Kiddush, it's a chelek, and that chelek is an opportunity for us to achieve and attain tremendous hasagos of Kedusha. I mentioned in terms of preparing for that this Pesach, we could be zoche to do the Korban Pesach. So Mori Rabbi Rav Nebenzahl actually has a hanhaga, which a few of his Talmidim follow, which expresses the optimism that we're still going to bring the Korban Pesach. The halacha is that a person needs Herav Shemesh in order to be, if he's mitaher, he needs Herav Shemesh in order to be able to go up to Harabayas and eat kachim. So Rav Nebenzahl says like this. Rav Nebenzahl says that really we should go to the mikveh, not Erev Pesach, like most are noeg to do, but rather the day before to be able to have Herav Shemesh. And that's how he's noeg, and some of his Talmidim are noeg that way as well. And that was with the belief that Mashiach is, that we could still bring Korban Pesach, Erev Pesach. So we go to the mikveh, the night before, so to have Herav Shemesh. So there's a Kedusha, there's something that's being set into motion, and that which is being set into motion already begins from that first night. So the takeaway number two is Kaddish means number one, hachana, to prepare, and that Kaddish is a statement that this is a night of that's mesugal for a tremendous amount of Kedusha. I've always been bothered, moving on to point number 3, going on to Magid, I've always been bothered that what exactly is this later edition of Halach Ma'anya? My father, Zechron Livracha, used to darshan a lot. The old days, I wonder if you experienced this. What my father did when we were little, you couldn't get away with today. My father at the Seder before Magid would say a drasha a half hour, 45 minutes long. So he would always darshan before Halach Ma'anya, and we as kids, we sat and we listened. It's a different generation. It's a different world. But we sat and we listened to my father. My father was speaking. We sat and we listened. It's a different world today. It's a different world. Anyhow, my father would often talk about this theme of Halach Ma'anya, and it's a funny thing because of course Halach Ma'anya is a later addition that was put into the Haggadah. What exactly is the reason that it's put in? So Harbe Perushim B'davar, but I always thought that Halach Ma'anya might explain. Interesting, guys lately have been asking me a lot about this. A fascinating halachic debate that begins with the Gemara in Psachim on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph. The Gemara describes a machlokes between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Meir, I believe, about whether you could be Yotzei Matzah Meiser Sheni. Could you use Matzah Meiser Sheni and of course, Rabbi Meir holds that Meiser Sheni is Mammon Gavoa, and the Rabbanan hold that you can use it. So there's a fascinating rush. I heard a beautiful shir years ago from Rav Shai Shechter on this, summarizing this rush that Rav Branchpiegel's Zatzal already years before mentions. Rav Shechter Shlita Yibadul Chaim also mentions this in his shiurim, that there is an Avnei Nezer based on this rush, that the rush says that the Gemara points out that there are the Gemara seems to say that it could very well be that Rabbi Meir is going to hold that you can't use matzah meiser sheni because it needs to be your matzah. So it's very, very unclear how to read the Shakavatari of the Gemara. Maybe in a moment I'll tell you how I read the Shakavatari, but let me immediately jump to the Shita of the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer says that the Rush learns from this Gemara that just like the halacha is that when it comes to a lulav hagazel it's possible because it's a chisarn lechem, so too matzah gzula is possible as well. In other words, the mashmos of the Gemara is that the reason why matzah meiser sheni you can't be yotze according to Reb Meir is he holds that's mammon gavoa, it doesn't belong to you. So therefore, the halacha is that if it's stolen, aside from mitzvah abba ba'avera, the matzah doesn't belong to you, and therefore you can't be yotze the mitzvah of matzah. So there's a famous chumrah of the Avnei Nezer, which is, many have begun to adopt it, although it's not found in Shulchan Aruch, and that is that you need to own the matzah. So some of the kollel guys came over to me and they asked me about, they heard that there's this chumrah that you need to own the matzah. So first of all, if you follow the shita of the Avnei Nezer, ein chanami that the Baal Habayis should be makna to people the matzah. I don't remember when Rabban Shmuel mentioned this chumrah whether he was into being machmir for it or not. But I was always struck, it's a logical Avnei Nezer that comes from the Rush, and there are many today who are choshesh for this shita, but I was always struck that for some reason it's not brought down in Shulchan Aruch, it's not brought down in earlier poskim, and I think the minig for generations, my family comes from Poland, I think and my father was very makbid to do everything that which his father did. I had never heard this until I was much, much older, this idea of being makna the matzah to somebody else. So I thought that what the Gemara is saying is as follows, that the Gemara never says that there's a chiyuv. In fact, the Gemara seems to even contrast it to the chiyuv of lulav. But rather the Gemara is saying if it doesn't belong to any Jew, then Rebbe Meir says, then it's going to be a problem because it needs to belong to someone in Klal Yisrael. It needs to belong to Klal Yisrael in general. So if it's Mammon Gavoa, that's going to be a problem. But the Gemara never says that there's a chiyuv of singular bailus when it comes to matzah like it does when it comes to lulav. There's no Gemara that says the matzaschen in the same way that we do olakachtem lochem. So again, the rush, that's where you have to take a look at the rush. The rush might be mashma that. But generally, and we don't see it lo reinu v'lo shamanu b'shulchan aruch that you should be makna the matzah beforehand. So what's pshat? So I thought that matzah and lulav al derech drush are entirely different. The muchus of the two mitzvahs are very, very different. There are many different explanations for the Tama mitzvah for lulav, but one of them is the Medrash says that after Yom HaKippurim, each one of us goes out like victorious warriors that are shaking the minim that express bounty and success, and so on and so forth. And that's what we do after Yom HaKippurim. That's what the Gemara says we do on Sukkot. On Pesach, what's the theme of Pesach? And this gets us to theme number 3. What's the theme of Pesach? The theme of Pesach is us becoming an Am. It's not you and I, each one of us on Yom HaKippurim coming out and being Zoche leChaim v'lo chas v'chalila hafuch. But rather, on Pesach, what we're celebrating is us becoming an Am. And with that comes a sense of responsibility for one person to each other. So the singular component of lulav, I think, is almost antithetically expressed by matzah. And hence, for sure, a sensitivity for chesed and so on, that Pesach is all about celebrating our sense of responsibility to each other, that sense of Am. Hence, when it comes to lulav, then you're going to have the Gzeres HaKosav. However, when it comes to matzah, matzah is an entirely different experience, and it's true, it has to belong to Klal Yisrael. Mammon Gavoa is going to be a problem, but once it belongs to Klal Yisrael, so then in such a case, there wouldn't be a problem, and there is no requirement of singular bailus of matzah, and that would be why, if for those other Rishonim, again, yesh lefalpel b'das harash, but and in Shulchan Aruch and so on, lo re'inu v'lo shamanu, this chumrah. And again, if you have a Masorah from your Rabbein, you should be makbid to be makna if you had a guest and so on and so forth. Children, I don't think there's any requirement because there's samich al Shulchan Aviv and so on and so forth. But for guests and so on, there are people that have this chumrah to explain why there's so many that don't have this chumrah. It could very well be that's what's going on, and that's what the emphasis of halach manya is. The emphasis of halach manya is that we come together as as an Am. That's what Yetzias Mitzrayim is about. We go from being individuals to being an Am, and that celebration is one in which we express. The greatest celebration that we have is the sense of concern and care that we have for each other, which reminds me that I didn't announce Mos Chitim. Mirza Hashem, I'll put out an announcement for Mos Chitim. Okay, so that's another theme. That's another theme of Leil Pesach, and that's what's being expressed in Halach Ma'anya. So number one was the differences between Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Number two is Kadesh, and number three is Halach Ma'anya. Now let's begin to discuss a little bit the structure of the Haggadah. There's a famous kasha that already the Rishonim deal with, that there isn't any bracha on Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, and there are many answers to the question of why there isn't a bracha on Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Maybe it's a mitzvah she'en lo shir, but I've always been intrigued, and I've discussed with the Chevra in the past. I've always been intrigued that there are Rishonim that find brachos on Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Of course, the Masada Rav Kook's edition of the Rishonim is fantastic. So there are Rishonim who find brachos that relate to Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, and I want to use these brachos as a discussion of the structure of Magid, how Magid is built. So, of course, after the later edition of Halach Ma'anya, so then we start with Manishtana. We have Avodim Ayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim, and then Amar Rebbe Lazar, and then we have Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenasan Torah L'Am Yisrael Baruch Hu. So, in the Meyuchas of the Pirush HaKadmon, he says, Sarich levarech al drasha sheratza lomar, that this bracha, Baruch Shenasan Torah L'Am Yisrael, is on the drashos that we're about to say. The Rashbeitz says, Al kain anu tzrichen levarech birchas haTorah al zos hadrasha. So, on the one hand, there is no bracha on Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. On the other hand, we do say Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenasan Torah L'Am Yisrael. There is some form of a bracha. Not only that, there's again the strange formulation of Baruch, but this is later on in the Haggadah. We have Baruch HaShomer Avtachas LiYisrael Baruch Hu Shakadosh Baruch Hu Chishev Es HaKetz. So what's going on? What is, if we have a bracha, why is that bracha not mentioned right in the beginning of Magid? And what is the significance of Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu that's right before the Arba Vanim? And then again, we have a bracha of Baruch Shem Avtachas LiYisrael Baruch Hu. We'll see in a moment how the Rishonim learned that bracha. So Rabbosai, leaving aside the answer of why all Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim doesn't have a bracha, it would seem to me that the reason why we have a bracha of Baruch HaMakom Baruch Shenasan Torah L'Am Yisrael reflects two dinim in Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, two components of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. And I think this is, if you haven't heard this before, this might be very, very, very helpful in terms of structuring the way you look at Magid in general. Manishtana and Avodim Ayinu is clearly the child asking. There were shinuyim that were done to encourage the child to ask. And my father, Zechrani Livracha, after Manishtana, after all the children would ask Manishtana, he would say, and this is how his father said it, this goes back all the way to Poland, is there en ferazoi, Avodim Ayinu lefaroi b'Mitzrayim? The answer is as follows, Avodim Ayinu lefaroi b'Mitzrayim. People have heard that? Yeah? Oh, wow. So it's not only my father. Is there en for azoy avodim ayinu lefari b'Mitzrayim? Okay. So what happens is you have this component, going back to our first point about the structure of Magid. The structure of Magid is clearly, a structure of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is clearly to encourage Sheila Utshuva. And there is this personal interaction between father and child. The Enfer Azai, when my father was saying the answer is Avodim Ayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim, what he was saying now is the time that the father addresses the child. Now, obviously, there are many things that are going on. You have to keep track of the clock in Shulchan Aruch and so on and so forth. But it would seem from the structure of the Haggadah, this is the time in which parents and children ask and discuss. It's the highlighted expression of the dialectic of the Derech Shelu Tshuva that we spoke about before. You have to keep an eye on the clock because your wife prepared for Shulchan Aruch, and you have to be sensitive. You have to be sensitive to her. My wife always reminds me that one of the first times we were by Rav Nebenzahl Shlita on Chol Moed Pesach, the first Rebbetzin, Allah Shalom, said to my wife, I told my husband that I worked hard for Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch is going to be a half hour, 40 minutes, and there's no negotiating. That's it. And by the way, Rav Nebenzahl finishes, even in those days, I think, finished Hallel before Chatzos. He starts off and he tells a little bit of midrashim to his grandchildren, and then they move. And he was careful to the sensitivity for the Rebbetzin. I can't say I'm always so sensitive to my wife. I try, but it's something to learn from. Some of us are not as great as our Rabbeim. We're marich and Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, but we're not. It's something for us to really, really think about, to try to think it. So there's a lot that's going on over here. So you have the Manishtana and Avodim Ayinu, and that is that moment B'derech Shelu Tshuva. Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal pointed out, he mamish was mechavein to the Pirush HaKadmon and the Rashbeitz over here. It's not. This is the beautiful Svei Dinim and Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. There are two things that are happening. There's this personal story between father and son, between father and daughter, mother and son, mother and daughter. There's this discussion that's going on, but we don't do it in a vacuum. It's not only a story about what happened to our great-grandparents, the story of the Holocaust for our family, and so on and so forth, but what holds Yadus together is its Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. So we start off and we address the child Basher Husham, as we're about to get to in the Arba Avanim. But at the same time, the understanding of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim has to be done through Torah Shebechsav and the drashos of Chazal. So Eino Chanami, there's no bracha on all of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, but there is a segue Lenias Daiti from after Avodah Meinu L'Parav Mitzrayim to Baruch Hamakom Baruch Hu Baruch Shenosan Torah L'Ama Yisrael. So what's happening now is, and that's what Keneged Arba Avanim Dibur Torah. It's not just that psychologists have information for us how to deal with different types of children, but also the Torah itself. And the drashos ironically start. And if I'm not mistaken, there are no drashos in Avodah Meinu. There's no drashos in Avodah Meinu. Avodah Meinu is the Baal Haggadah describing it. And of course, everybody should say what the Baal Haggadah says. But every single one of us is the Baal Haggadah at the Seder. And we respond to our children. And all that appears beforehand is the concluding line, is rayos to this idea of Chol Mar B'Lisap B'Tzias Mitzrayim with the Maisa Tanoim. But all of the drashos in which we have the interplay between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh and the drashos of Chazal v'chulei, all of that only begins with Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. So there's no bracha on Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, but there is a Birchas HaTorah, and that is a subsection in Magid. The lesson of that, lesson number 4, is that we don't perceive anything, and this is a very, very important point. We don't perceive anything in a vacuum without Torah and without Chazal. Everything that we're going through now, we have to figure out how to perceive it through Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Yes, of course, every situation is unique. Every situation is personal. And we need to talk to the children about the Nisam HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done to us through the eyes that we have, through the way we experience what's going on in Tafshin Pei Vav. But at the same time, we also have to think about how we're going to present it to our children through the perspective of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Without it, eventually what happens is the Masorah gets lost. That's the magic of our Masorah. The magic of our Masorah is is this dialectic. That on the one hand, we have the personal manishtan and the avodim ayinu, yet at the same time, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, and that's what the Pirush HaKadmon is coming to emphasize. Okay, so that's lesson, if you will, takeaway number 4 is this idea that on the one hand it's personal, it's manishtan avodim ayinu, yet at the same time, immediately we go into through the drashos of Chazal, and you and I have to think about how we're going to present Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, not just only in its personal way, but the way in which we show our children how the Torah, both Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh, relate to their experiences. Of course, the famous kasha and the famous answer in the Arba Vanim is that it's not so different, the statement of the Chacham versus the statement. I realize it's getting late, Rabbi. If anybody has to leave, please feel comfortable to leave. That in the Arba Vanim, the Chacham asks, Ma ha'edos v'achugim ha'shpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. And the Rasha also asks, Ma avoda zois lachem. Yet the difficulty is that with the Chacham, we answer him with Af ata emer lo kilchas ha'pesach ein maftirin achar ha'pesach ach v'komen. Yet when it comes to the Rasha, we say he's hoitzias asmo min haklal kafar beikar. So what is the difference between the two? So one of the explanations, I don't remember which of the Achronim makes this point, is that the difference between the Chacham and the Rasha is that the Chacham says, Asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. He asks, he doesn't understand. Ma'edes v'achukim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is still in the picture. While the Rasha says, Ma avoida zois lachem. Of course, these are psukim, Chacham Dvarim Chvav, and the Rasha Shmos Yud Beis. And so there's a subtle difference, and this is something that becomes not related to Leil Seder, but a very, very important point for us to keep in mind in Chinuch. And there, Baruch Hashem, I'm zocheh to be speaking to quite a few mechanechim here, but it applies to everybody, whether they're professionally a mechanech or not. There are two types of questions. There's the question of the Chacham, there's the question of the Rasha. The difference between the two, of course, is best expressed with a beautiful story. I think it's of Reb Chaim Brisker. I heard someone lately say from Reb Chaim Volozhin, but I remember it being from Reb Chaim Brisker that there were challenges of the Enlightenment already in Volozhin at the time with Reb Chaim, and some of the boys saw that there was someone who had real questions in Emunah. There were things that were bothering him. Reb Chaim then was already extremely popular and extremely busy, but the Talmidim asked Reb Chaim if he could sit and talk to the fellow who had questions about Emunah. And Reb Chaim sat with him for an extended period of time, and it seemed to have been successful. A few weeks later, the boys brought Reb Chaim somebody else who had kashas and Emunah. And Reb Chaim said, he said either he had a sense what the boy had was bothering him, or he sat down with the boy for a few minutes, and Reb Chaim did not help the second boy. And Reb Chaim said to the other Talmidim, he said to them, Far kashes there zenen terutzim, aber far terutzim zenen nish kein terutzim. For questions there are answers, but for answers there are no answers. And to have the awareness that there's sometimes that people are asking questions, and these are not justifications, but they're truly questions. They're questions that bother them. They might be strong questions, and that might even lead to crisis, but they're really, really questions. And every once in a while, they're terutzim, they're answers. They're trying to justify what they've chosen already. And so the suggestion goes that the Chacham, when he asks, when he brings HaKadosh Baruch Hu in it, so he's saying, I want to understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's something here I don't understand. Versus Ma avoda azos lachem, that's a teretz. That's already a justification. For terutzim, the zen nishkein terutzim. And that's something, we have to be open and loving to every single Jew. Every single Jew. even the Rasha. But at the end of the day, we have to recognize that there are times that there are kashas that deserve terutzim, and then there's terutzim. And for terutzim, we don't have terutzim. So that would be lesson number 5, I think, that we're up to, that comes away with the Chacham versus the Rasha. There's another very, very powerful, and that's lesson number 6, of the terutz to the Chacham. And the Chacham's answer is, the answer that we give the Chacham doesn't really address the question of why, or doesn't even fully address the question of what. And of course, here the Gra has the girsa, ad what type of answer is it? And the answer is to many, many chachamim. The answer is go learn. Go learn. You know, another maisa that they say from these heady days in the Enlightenment in Poland or in Litva, that they say that there were once 2 boys who had grown up in a small shtetl, and they were going out to the real world. They were close friends, and both of them had different questions. Both of them had questions. And they promised, one of them was going to university and the other one was going to yeshiva. And they promised each other that they were going to meet after a couple of years and discuss the questions that were on their minds. And they met a couple of years later, and the fellow who had gone to university, who in those days when you went to university, it was very, very hard to still be religious. I'm talking about before Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Soloveitchik went to university, even years before. Even then it was difficult. But Kal V'chomer 50 years before that. And the yeshiva bacher and the university student met each other afterwards, and the university student said, "What about the questions that we had?" He said, "Those questions, I don't fully have answers to them, but they don't bother me anymore. Those questions don't bother me anymore." A lot of times when Talmidim have questions when they're starting out, it's because of, if they would have a broader perspective, many of those questions, some of those questions we're not supposed to have answers for. That it requires hadracha, hachvana. We ourselves need hadracha about how we're supposed to answer difficult questions. But some of those questions don't bother a person anymore. So if you really, really spend time learning the first parak of Pesachim and the second parak of Pesachim, okay, maybe you'll skip the Kachim Sugyas, but you shouldn't. And then you learn the Arvei Pesachim and so on. Many of those things, many of those things will eventually have a context. And then when a person has that context, so then he realizes that there are certain things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want him to answer. That becomes part of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The more and more a person understands the dynamic of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah, the more and more a person has a sense of what are those questions that are supposed to remain unanswerable, and what are those questions that need to be fully addressed. So that's a very, very important takeaway as well. And it applies also with our children, that more and more we're zocha to have our children to be surrounded by Kedusha, V'Tahara, and Amelus Batorah, and so on. The more and more, there are just certain things that just become natural. That not everything, let me say it this way, not everything has to be explained to a child. In other words, I believe that most children today, we don't need to explain to them, we shouldn't feel the responsibility to explain to them why they shouldn't have a smartphone. They should grow up in a culture where it's a hanacha that children don't have smartphones. Not everything needs to be explained. And because there are questions that sometimes the answers that we have, I had a Bli Ein Hara, one of my children is really, really, really sharp, and would try to get me to answer the question of whatever they wanted or so on and so forth. And they were so sharp, whatever, that child plays chess a lot better than I do. And whatever I was going to say, and the child when they were 6 or 7 years old was already 4 or 5 steps ahead of me. Children could be Bli Ein Hara could be very, very, very smart. In other words, there are questions that don't have answers and don't necessarily need to be addressed. But rather, when you grow up in a certain culture where there are certain hanachos, when you get older, you might understand it. You might not understand it right now. And the more and more we put them in this situation where they're surrounded with eidos, chukim v'mishpatim, even if they don't understand the eidos, chukim v'mishpatim, as long as you're showing love and care and you never chas v'chala denigrate what's bothering them, never denigrate what's bothering them, always show respect to where they are, b'asher usham, but that not everything, and never to use sarcasm, but not everything requires a teretz, and afuch, immerse yourself in Maseches Pesachim, throw yourself in, don't live a life where you're being exposed to all those things that everybody else in the street is being exposed to, and eventually then come back to me when you're 18, 19 years old, and we'll see if you regretted the chinuch that we gave you. And that's something we have to do as a community. It's not something one family could do on their own. If all the other children are then surrounded by something else, then it becomes much more difficult. So this yisod, that not every time does a question required to be answered directly, and rather to surround the child with the kedusha Maseches Pesachim, to surround them with eidos, chukim, and mishpatim, and then eventually we'll see if the questions bother you. Eventually, there's going to come a time where we're going to have to address the question. But sometimes our children bring us in to something that they're not ready for that discussion. They're too young for that discussion. It's a balance, it's a dialectic in terms of what I'm describing. On the one hand, you have to show the child a tremendous amount of respect and never, ever, chas v'chala denigrate or to dismiss and so on and so forth. If it's important for the child, then it's important to you. But even though we're supposed to show our child a tremendous amount of respect, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily they are ready to hear the answer for the question. For my Girsa Diankis, I do remember something from "You can't handle the truth. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth." Right? There's something to that. That not at every single time in our lives is it right for us to hear the full truth. And so therefore, to the chacham, the child, the chacham, sometimes the chacham is too smart for his own good, and chas v'chalila, he's not too far away from just taking out Asher Tziva Hashem Elokeinu Eschem, and if you take out the Elokeinu Eschem, then he's ending up to an entire adversarial place. And what we want to do is say, no, we're not ready for that. Eventually, right now, immerse yourself in a world that's full of kedusha and tara, and eventually you're going to see the answers to those approaches. Okay, so that lesson is that what we learned from the Chacham is this idea that sometimes immersion is the teretz, and doesn't always mean that we're supposed to offer our children, who are sometimes a lot sharper than we are, the answer to the question. So that's the structure, B'siyata d'Shmaya. No bracha for Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. We didn't really give a full teretz to why there's no bracha on Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, but let's run with that. Manishtana avodim ayinu, the personal, Baruch Shem Avtachas Yisrael, that the Torah already gives us eitzah how to do with children, and then we begin Yachal Merosh Chodesh, etc., and describing, beginning the Maschil B'Gnus B'Sayim B'Shevach with Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah. And that theme of the drashos is going to go throughout Magid. That's going to be the quote-unquote long, boring part of Magid, where you have all the drashos, and that requires Amelus to give meat to it, but at least the structure is there. Once we've begun Maschil B'Zos B'Sayim Shav, two more points, B'Siyat Shmai. Again, I know it's late. Please feel free if you have to go home. Once we begin Maschil B'Gnos V'Sayim B'Shevach, that's the second part of the kiyum that we said, according to the Rambam, Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah, Hayu Avoseinu. So then again we have a bracha. Baruch Shem Avtachas Yisrael Baruch Hu, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Chishev Esaketz Lasos Kemo Shenemar LaAvram Avinu B'Bris Bein HaBesarim. So just like we had a bracha on Drashas HaTorah, so too we have we have another bracha. Now, what's this bracha? This bracha is a mind-boggling bracha. The Miyuchas L'Rashi says, on Baruch Shem Avtachas Yisrael, L'kach mevarchim Hashem b'yiridas havas Mitzrayim, v'fi shekeshem shemevarchin al toiva, kach mevarchin al hara. Just like there's that we make a bracha, that's the sugya in Maseches Brachos, the bracha even of Dayina Emes. So it's amazing. We have a ke'ein berchas Dayina Emes, Baruch Shem Avtachas Yisrael Baruch Hu, Shachadish Baruch Hu Chi Sheves Haketz Lasos Kamo She'amar L'Avram Avinu Bibris Bein HaBesarim. So what exactly is this Kishem Shemevarchim Ala Tov, Kach Mevarchin Ala Ra? So on the simple level, it's the Maschel Bignus V'Sayim B'Shevach. And that is that we recognize that there are times that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put us in very, very difficult and very painful positions, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what He's doing. Because we're about to say, Sha'Kadosh Baruch Hu Chishev es haketz. In other words, that just because we went through terrible, terrible times, that doesn't mean that what was very painful for us isn't the best for us. There is a beautiful mashal that is, I think, wrongly attributed to the Nesivis. The Nesivis has a beautiful Haggadah called the Maisanisim Haggadah, but it's not. I've checked the Haggadah many, many times and many different editions, and I've never seen this unless it's somewhere else. And Nesivis was a very prolific author, but I don't think it's in the Nesivis' Haggadah. But there's a very, very powerful mashal. And the mashal goes as follows, that there was a fellow who was walking down the street, and all of a sudden this gangster comes up to him, and he takes a metal crowbar, comes behind him, and he smashes his two knees. And the guy is on the ground in terrible, terrible pain. And he's there for a minute or two. He can't stand up. His two knees have been shattered. He can't get up. And he hears footsteps coming back to him. And he looks up. The guy must have hit him from in front, because he recognized the guy comes back and he's looking over him. And he's thinking, that's it, he's gonna kill me. The guy looks down to him and he says to him, "You look like you're in terrible shape. Come, let me take you to the hospital." The same guy who had just smashed his kneecaps. And he picks him up tenderly, and he puts him in his car, and he brings him to the hospital. The guy passes out in his hospital bed. And he wakes up, and looking over him is that same guy again in doctor scrubs. And the doctor says to him, "I was watching you walk, and I saw by the way you're walking that you have a terrible, terrible disease, that if your knees aren't broken shortly, then you'll suffer terribly for the rest of your life." That's the mashal. And the nimshal is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who smashed our kneecaps. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when He puts Klal Yisrael through its awful, awful tsaros, is actually saving Klal Yisrael. And this applies to many, many parts of Jewish history. In terms of Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's pashut that Klal Yisrael could not have been formed as a nation without the Kur HaBarzel. The Kur HaBarzel of Mitzrayim, where we had to cleanse ourselves and we had to go through the process of be avadim in order to be avadim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu chishev es haketz. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is chishev es haketz. And this applies also in our personal lives, and these are part of the questions that we don't have answers to, that we see suffering. Unfortunately, there are some of us who have gone through suffering, and we don't have answers to those questions, but we recognize, emunah is that we recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing Kol Ma David Rachman L'Tav Ovid, even though there are things that we can't explain from the narrow perspective we have. But this doctor saw something in this person that was actually deadly, whatever it might be, a blood clot or whatever it might be that he had, that if he didn't break his knees, then he would have been in a lot worse shape. And that's of the bracha of Kishem Shemevarchen Al Tov Kach Mevarchen Al Ra. The bracha of Mevarchen Al Ra is we recognize that even though we don't understand it, and we might never understand it in this world, that doesn't mean it's not L'Tova Say. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a meitiv, and even the most difficult things in our lives that we go through is from the hatava of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, many of those things that we won't understand. So that's the pshat of how to read Baruch Shem Avtechasai, and then what emerges then, again, in terms of the structure of Magid, again, is the personal manishtana, the personal avodim ayinu. We start with the Baruch Shenasan Torah Yisrael, the drashos. Then we go from the manishtana, the first din of the Rambam, to the second din of Maschel B'Gnus V'Sayim B'Shevach. And in Maschel B'Gnus V'Sayim B'Shevach is the moment to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Baruch Shem Avtechasai Yisrael is Kishem Shem Mevarchen Al Hatov Kach Mevarchen Al Ra. Based on this, one could explain that there is an extra letter in Magid. What's that extra letter? In the next part, V'hi she'amda lavosenu v'lanu shalachad bilvad amar aleinu l'chalasenu. So if you ask the average Jew who's sitting and listening to Yonatan Razel and Yaakov Shweki, may they be well, sing their beautiful, beautiful song, Hi she'amda, you ask them, what's the message of Hi she'amda? So the crescendo of the song, the way we sing it in Eretz Yisrael, and it's understandable, is V'akadosh Baruch Hu. That's the crescendo, right? V'akadosh Baruch Hu matzileinu miyadam. But if that's so, then the vav is extra. Then it should be Hi she'amda lavosenu. What was amda lavosenu v'lanu? Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu matzileinu miyadam. And that's the way it's taught, it's saying in Israel today. But there's a vav here, Rabbi say. Geshmak, no? There's a vav. V'hi she'amda lavosenu v'lanu. Shelo achad b'lvada amar aleinu l'chalosenu. It's this that was omed lavosenu. It was this that my great-grandparents who were killed by the Nazis, al Kiddush Hashem, that they knew, I'm sure that they knew this when they were being killed al Kiddush Hashem. And that is Baruch Shem Avtechas Yisrael Baruch Hu, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Chishe V'Saketz, V'hi She'amda Lavosenu V'Lanu. This is what kept our grandparents. This is what kept those Jews who have, in the last year and a half, have gone through terrible, terrible Yisurim. V'hi she'amda lavosenu Baruch Shem Avtechas Yisrael Baruch Hu. That Kishem Shem Mevarchen Al Tov Kach Mevarchen Al Ra. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Chishe V'Saketz. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ein Chanami. For many of us, we're Zoch of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Matzileinu Miyadam. But there's some people that don't see HaKadosh Baruch Hu Matzileinu Miyadam. Don't see it. But it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chishe V'Saketz. That's the Vav HaChibur. V'hi she'amda lavosenu v'lanu. It's not just a song of the victory of the Jewish people. I think sometimes in Eretz Yisrael, we get caught up in that a little bit. The Nitzachon of Am Yisrael Beretz Yisrael. And there is, Baruch Hashem, have been a lot of Yeshuas and Niflos and amazing things. But you get the sense when you watch the video from the concert is that, this bravado that has HaKadosh Baruch Hu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzileinu miyadim. And this is part of is also part of the tragic story of the Jewish people that continues until the Geula Asida will be with us. And it's not only that we have emunah bitachon shakadosh baruch hu matzileinu miyadam, but it's Baruch Shem Avtechas Yisrael Baruch Hu shakadosh baruch hu chishe v'saketz. And that's something that we have to pass on to our children. That's something that becomes an integral part of us. An integral part of us is that the recognition that we are part of an amazing story of Masorah. Many of the parts of it are tragic. And the resolution, the Geula, the full triumph we haven't yet experienced. It's still distant to us. And that allows us also to connect better to those people who are still going through tzara. It allows us to experience halach ma'anya better. But it also is a more realistic description of the story of Am Yisrael, even the story of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, to to our children. The triumph is not complete, and the triumph is not going to be complete until the Beis Hamikdash is built, and we're still in many ways in Golus in Eretz Yisrael. I know sometimes it bothers people when I say that, but it's true. It's true, because the haraya is that we're still saying v'hisham delavosenu in the sense that we're still in tremendous pains of Golus. We as a community have gone through tremendous tzara. Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael is going through tremendous tzara. The situation for the Jews in Chutz La'aretz is very precarious, very precarious. All of that, our children need to internalize that Kadosh Baruch Hu, that we are part of this beautiful story, and our heroes are Rabbi Chanan Vasim and Zeichet Tzaddik Kadosh Baruch Hu, who was killed al Kiddush Hashem. That's part of our story. We don't reject that part, and we recognize that that's all part of who we are and what we are today. And Baruch Hashem, we're for sure steps closer to Geula. We're steps closer, but it's not in any way complete. So that sense of identity that our children should have, that sense of identity that we're part of a story that's painful, obviously it needs to be age appropriate, a story that is painful but is glorious, that we're still doing this, and that we are building towards Geula. Last point, the beautiful Vart that concludes the Haggadah. Maybe we'll come back to the Yisod that I was saying from the Rebbe of Varka. It starts as a halachic ha'ara. We conclude Magid. As I mentioned, I described to you my brother. We conclude with lefichach, and we say lebishas lavasenu v'lanu es kol nisam elo hotzianu mi'abdus lecheres mi'yagol l'simcha me'evel yamta f'me'afel l'argadol mishibud l'geula v'noimar lefanav shira chadasha halaluka, and then we go into this beautiful hallel of halaluka halu avdei Hashem. So I don't recall many examples where we have in halacha where the Mishnah Berurah quotes achronim, very reputable achronim, that make a ha'ara about what the text should be, how the text should be changed, and no one listened to it. It's even in a Mishnah Berurah. How do you vowelize the words me'afela la'ar gadol, mishibud l'geula, Vav Nun Aleph Mem Reish Lefanav Shira Chadasha Halaluka. So the Mishnah Berurah quotes, who's he quote from? The Levush? Quotes from the Levush, I believe, that says that the vowelization should be V'ne'emar Lefanav Shira Chadasha Halaluka. Taisus in Psachim describes, Baruch Hashem, we celebrated a birth in the shul this week. So Taisus describes in Psachim, on this, where Taisus discusses in Arvei Psachim, the Hallel. So Taisus describes that Shira Chadasha is the song that a woman sings when she gives birth to a child. Taisus says, but it's different than the song that the husband sings. He says the husband is la-di-da. The husband, he has a beautiful baby, Baruch Hashem, and he didn't have to go through the Chevlei Leida. So says Taisus, that's why the correct gear, so this everybody agrees, everybody accepted this from Taisus, that the gear says not Lefan of Shir Chadash, but rather Shir Chadash. Why? Because we haven't been Zocha to the Shir Chadash. We're still in Golus. We haven't been Zocha to the Shir Chadash. So therefore, says Taisus, the song that we're singing is a song of going out of Mitzrayim. It's Shira Chadasha. Okay, very nice. Comes along, that's the Taisus. Comes along the Mishnah Berurah, he quotes from Achrayim. He says, so if we're not talking about singing in the future, we're talking about singing in the past. If we're talking about singing in the past, then the appropriate vowelization is V'ne'emar Lefanav. We said in the past Shira Chadasha, not V'noimar. What are we going to be Noimar in the future? We're going to be Noimar Shir Chadash B'siyata D'Shmaya. So why is it V'ne'emar? So I can't think of many examples where you have a Mishnah Berurah, where you have Achronim. quote unquote, Balbatim could be difficult. The printers could be difficult. But at the end of the day, it's a fascinating phenomenon that no one listened. No one listened. And the Magen Avram, I think, already quotes this. And all the Haggadahs have V'noimar l'fanav shir chadasha. Until the Brisker Rav came along. And he said beautifully, he said, Chayiv Adam liros es atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. You're supposed to visualize yourself as if you went out of Mitzrayim. That's mamish what we just said. Leficha chanachnu. That was the chalois that we said after the three distinctions of Reb Chaim that Reb Branspiegel mentioned, that the whole goal is liros es atzmo. So therefore, what we're about to do is to sing the shira of coming out of Mitzrayim, ba'asid. Ba'asid means we're about to do it, but what shira? Not the shira of the final gula. Hence, Klal Yisrael paskin against this Mishnah Berurah. Paskin against this Mishnah Berurah, Klal Yisrael paskin, and I don't know anybody that says v'ne'emar. I don't know, you'll tell me if you know somebody. The correct girsa is, as was L'dorei Doros, not to change it, v'noimar lefanav shir chadasha. So the avoda of Leil HaPesach is to reach the place that visualize ourselves as if we've gone out of Mitzrayim with all the brachos, and that's where we come full circle. That's where Rabbi Yitzchak Avarka had said that we say lo esavol seinu bilvad Gol HaKadosh Baruch Hu ela af osanu goel imaim. So what did we mention? That the kedusha of Leil Pesach is what? The pasuk of Meicha ki meitzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim erenu niflos. So af osanu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out. Also, HaKadosh Baruch Hu put into play all of the Yeshuas of Klal Yisrael, all the Yeshuas, even the Yeshuas that we experienced last year in the 12-day war, v'chulei, all of that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put into play with Yitzias Mitzrayim, and what we're singing on is all of those things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed us to experience, and we experienced as a klal, and be'ezras Hashem, this Leil Pesach, we should be zocha to really truly feel Ki'ilu Yatzanu miMitzrayim, and all the mashmos of what that is. And Be'ezras Hashem Yisparech, who knows? Maybe even this year we'll be zocha not only to sing a shir chadasha, but to sing a shir chadash.